Welcome to the webinar on how to measure science literacy, a cross-curricular journey to improve student literacy skills. My name is Ewell Phillips, and I am a science educator at Hill Friedman World Academy in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So before we begin, I just want you to take 1 minute. You can pause the webinar if you need to, but take 1 minute to answer this question for each of the statements listed A through D. How important is it for students to practice these skills? 0 for not important at all to 4, absolutely essential. Skill A is to explain the way in which science is applied and used to address a specific problem or issue. Skill B is to discuss and evaluate the implications of using science to solve a problem or issue, interacting with a factor. Skill C, consistently apply scientific language to communicate understanding clearly and precisely. And skill D, document sources completely. So again, how important is it for students to practice these skills? 0 to 4. Take 1 minute to answer these questions. Now that you've had a chance to look over these skills and evaluate how important they are to you and for your students to learn, I now want you to look at how are these skills evidenced in your classroom or curriculum today. So you're either going to rate yourself as either non-existent, existent, evident, or equal and explicit. And I've given some examples. So if you're non-existent, that means your traditional classroom where you focus on a lot of content knowledge and you really don't get to spend a lot of time developing those skills. Whereas some of you watching this webinar may be STEM educators. And so in your STEM class, you actually get to practice these skills very often or similar skills. Take about 30 seconds to classify yourself. So before we completely dive in, let me give you a little bit more background about myself. I have completed 8 years of science teaching at Hill Friedman World Academy, which is an international baccalaureate or IB school, and it's in the school district of Philadelphia. Before becoming an educator, I was a former biomedical engineer in orthopedic implant research. Now, I've personally never participated in high school science competitions, but a lot of the skills that we're getting ready to discuss with science literacy are applicable to helping students in that area. So here's our roadmap. The objective, finally revealed, is that teachers will be able to reflect on their personal philosophy of scientific literacy to discuss strategies for improving science literacy in students. The concept here is reading is fundamental. Just keep it simple. So as far as our agenda, we've already begun to explore what our personal science literacy philosophy might be. Then we'll look at some science literacy strategies, student work, data, and the lessons learned. So this is an actual story of what I've gone through in trying to improve science literacy in my school. So I have another question for you. I know we're exploring a lot of philosophy right now, but I want you to brainstorm, think, write, share. How do you measure or address, or have you ever addressed and measured science literacy in a classroom? If you need to pause the webinar, pause it, think about it, reflect. What does the assessment of science literacy look like to you? So let's take a moment to interject the context of how we're exploring all of this. This is a real problem at my school. As of 2021, these are our STAR reading data. STAR is just a test that our students take every quarter, but you can see our participants from 6th through 12th grade. And the data I'm actually going to show you in my story And the data I'm actually going to show you in my story is actually the 9th grade class of students when they become 10th graders in chemistry class. But my school is an urban school where literacy rates are low across the entire school. As you can see, 43% of my students are actually at grade level or above, and then 56 or 57% are beneath grade level when it comes to reading. So our school solution was to come up with writing across the curriculum. Each department was tasked with developing a performance-based writing assessment, and these assessments are administered and graded bi-weekly. So we have this problem at school. How do you go about explaining this to your students now that all of a sudden you have to start teaching them how to write? How many of us have actually been in a science class where we've been tasked with writing an essay, not just writing a constructive response, but writing an essay about science? Probably very few of us. So now the question becomes, what is the why? Why do our students need to do this? Why is science literacy important? And what would you say to your students? Take about a minute, pause the webinar if you need to. Now that you've had a chance to think about what you would say to students, here's what people are already saying. The more you read, the more you know, the more places you will go. Dr. Seuss. Everybody loves Dr. Seuss, I hope. Also, literacy is a bridge from misery to hope. Quote by Kofi Annan. But does it really matter what others are saying? Because It's about what you, the teacher, has to say about literacy. And it's not just what you say about it, it's how do you say it? How are you delivering the concept of literacy to your students? So let me give you an example of what I have told my students. Literacy will determine your access to specific audiences and the resources that you will inherit from those audiences. This is what I tell students. I have developed my personal philosophy as to why I believe students should develop scientific literacy. So if you decide to use some of the tools I'm presenting to you today, it's important that you have an answer for your students because they are going to ask. Here's one way I have introduced this to my students in a way that is actually socially acceptable in my classroom. I do teach students that are predominantly African American and underrepresented. And so one of the videos that came out during the pandemic was the Masterclass Black History, Freedom and Love program. And as I was watching the program, I came across episode 15, Why HBCUs. This interview was conducted by Jelani Cobbs, American writer and author. And he briefly shares his testimony about his writing journey and getting into college. So I share this video with my students and have a discussion with them about how writing can actually influence the places that you actually will go. So why should you, the teacher, be interested in this presentation? Well, many students need to write a scientific paper for many science competitions, including the Science Talent Search and the NAACP AXO competition. Literacy skills are also necessary for collecting background research. Maybe you just want to break the tradition in assessing student performance in a science class. And finally, equity. The approach to science literacy that I'm going to show you today actually has less emphasis on content knowledge, which is actually contrary to what we do traditionally in science class. And while equity, in a sense, can be framed around serving underrepresented groups, equity in this sense really means giving every student an opportunity to develop and demonstrate their understanding of science, regardless of their deficits or advantages. Now, there is actually very limited research on science literacy in the classroom and how that affects academic performance. But here's what I've been able to find. And what I've found is that middle school students were assigned science discovery narratives, SDNs, and traditional biographical text. And students who read science discovery narratives were more likely to ask questions about science, and students expressed that these narratives made scientists more realistic and relatable. So there's a suggestion that there may be a boost in comprehension skills, but there's not much evidence out there. So again, back to our story, we're looking at students from my school from back in 2021 when their literacy rates were below grade level. So since we are a 6 through 12 school, we had to come up with two ways to address the writing across the curriculum challenge. So for grades 6 through 9, which are our tested subjects, we simply used sampled and released constructed response items from state standardized exams. So what did we do from grades 10 on up? From grades 10 on up, we use the International Baccalaureate Middle Years Program Criterion D assessment rubric. This particular rubric assesses a student's ability to reflect on the impacts of science. So the protocol was to have students read a news article and develop a written response using a scaffolded writing tool. And the majority of the news articles selected came from Science News Explorers. You can use any science article that you want. You can use a science research paper. But this is where we started, given that we had a very limited time frame to design this process. This list should look familiar. It's the same list that I showed you at the beginning of the webinar, where you had to evaluate how important these skills were for students to learn. These are the same skills that are assessed in the International Baccalaureate Middle Years Program Science Criterion D. Now, you don't have to be an international baccalaureate school to use these rubrics, but I think the great thing about them is that they upgrade Bloom's taxonomy with grade level and with the skill ability of the student. So by the 10th grade, an excellent reflection on the impacts of science requires a student to explain the ways in which science is applied and used to address a problem, and then discuss and evaluate the implications of the science and its application. If it's not excellent, this would fall down to an 8th grade comprehension level. An above average reflection on the impacts of science would mean that the student would be able to describe, discuss, and analyze. The average 10th grade student would be able to summarize the science and then describe and summarize some of the implications of using science. Don't get it twisted. This is not for me to say that a student has a 6th grade level of interpreting science. If I was to give this same assessment to a 6th grade student, which we are not doing in our school, but if I could, a student who is able to summarize a news article and describe and summarize the significance of the research in that article would actually get an A. So if you wanted to use this for other grade levels other than the 10th grade, you would just need to shift around the Bloom's taxonomy. So now I'm going to give you some examples of how I explicitly used to apply this rubric in science class. I used to give element projects where students would have to give the pros and cons of fluorine or an element that they chose. I would even have the students work on a crystal gems project where they would look at minerals and ores from around the world and give some of the advantages and disadvantages, whether they're scientific, social, economic, etc. And then another example is the chemical composition project, where I would have students actually pick two chemicals and compare their chemical compositions and the advantages and disadvantages. And this could include drugs, pharmaceutical drugs, or even food additives. The problem with all of these assessments is that because they were all project based, my students never really took them seriously. So one of the skills that they always suffered or scored the lowest on is being able to discuss and evaluate the significance of using science and the application to solve a problem. So these group projects were very superficial ways of being able to get students to demonstrate their skills. But I was never actually taking the time to show students how do you improve those skills and actually get a higher grade, even though they had the rubrics. Now let's get into the writing tool that I would give to my students to help them write these constructed responses or essays. Here's the rubric. Here are some tips that they would receive. And then in order to help students actually apply vocabulary, I actually needed to explicitly state how many scientific terms they needed to use consistently, and also exploring the quality of their citations, because many of them can write quotes, but can they properly cite? That's a whole different story. So the writing across the curriculum challenge was given across 12 weeks in the entire school year. The first 4 weeks of assignments were given in this format. I simply gave them the prompts and I gave them writing space and a rubric at the end. After I read the students' work for a couple of weeks, I realized I needed a strategy to help them improve their science literacy. So the next step was actually to begin scaffolding. Instead of giving them a blank template, I began to actually give them guided questions that I could universally use for every single writing prompt. And so I began the scaffolding process in week 5, and I still continue to use it to this day. So when it comes to scientific literacy, the two main components are the explanation of scientific knowledge and then discussion and evaluation of its application and its significance. So criterion D1 is the explanation of the science, and these are all of the prompts that I provide to my students. I give them opportunity to describe the problem, describe the solution, explain why scientists look for the solution, and explain the science behind how the problem actually works. Today, I've even given them sentence starters, especially now that I have some English language learners in my classroom. And I did the same for being able to discuss and evaluate the significance of the science application, strengths, limitations, wonderings. What are some positive wonderings? What are some negative wonderings? Are these wonderings ethical, scientific, economic, religious, political, etc.? We want students to be able to apply the knowledge outside of just science. Science application needs to be connected to our students' lives. And so this is a way to help them connect to that. And then finally, evaluate. Tell me whether or not the science is actually good in this research. Will it actually benefit you or humanity at all? And then provide the evidence. And once again, sentence starters for each one of these phases. Let's take a moment to look at some student work. This particular work comes from a Science News Explorer article, Clay, A New Way to Fight Germs. And these are examples of work that I would actually show students after they've completed these to give them feedback. One of the challenges that I came across was that students struggled to tell the difference between describing a cause and explaining a cause. And so I needed to give them examples of when students actually did well and when they did poorly. Both of these examples are well-written descriptions of the problem that was being addressed in the text. Not every student's answer is going to be exactly the same, but if they're able to take evidence from the text and use it to support the prompt, then they are most likely going to earn the points or provide evidence that they know how to describe or meet the criteria in the box or in the prompt. But the key thing that these two answers have in common was that they were able to pull out the information that bacteria can change their genes over time, or they can change over several generations, and that they can become immune to certain medicines or certain treatments or things that are threatening their lives. Here's an example of a student being able to provide a solution, describe a solution to the problem. They're describing how does the solution actually work. And in this case, bacteria like to absorb iron, but if they get too much iron, it makes them sick. And the student realized that different colors of clay had different concentrations of iron, affecting bacteria differently. Now, here's an example of an explanation as to why scientists are looking for a problem. Students need to see how significant the reading is, so they were able to show how If clay could be used to kill bacteria, then that means we have another method for fighting off diseases that can cause kidney failure. And the student was able to find that. Now, this is a chemistry class, and this made my heart jump because the student actually was using words like oxidize. They noticed that iron can change its form, and the form of iron affects whether or not the bacteria will be able to digest the iron. So they were able to explain why the solution works in some cases and why it doesn't. Now I just want to show you a comparison between a good response and then one that doesn't meet the criteria of an explanation. This response is a sufficient explanation. However, there were some mistakes in the language. As I was reading this, I noticed that the student may have gotten confused, and instead of using the word clay, they probably wrote bacteria. And now their explanation is not as clear as, say, the previous student's work. But now, same prompts, but a completely different response here, explaining why the solution doesn't work. The reason why this doesn't meet the criteria, as hard as the student worked to write this or copy and paste this, because they did do this electronically, is that this is a description of the results. It's not an explanation of why the solution works. The student basically gave a description of which color clays were able to kill bacteria and which ones were not able to. So again, even though the student wrote a hefty paragraph, this is not evidence, and they would actually get less points for not providing an explanation. And so here's some example of feedback that I would give the students. And this is actually based on a Science News Explorer article. Snail slime and gold could boost the power of sunscreens and more. So I would give them these slides and say, hey, here's how you clearly identify a problem. And here's some things you could have quoted or stated explicitly to fix that problem. There's two ways you could have explained the science, because there's always more than one way to earn points. You could have described reduction of gold particles, or you could explain what causes gold to clump together. If students have problems resummarizing research, I point out things like a lot of you pointed out positives, but you didn't point out anything negative. Not everything that we do is positive in science. Sometimes it's bad, and you need to be okay with saying that it's bad and it's good. Also showing students that in this particular section of the evaluation, you can actually give your opinion. And a lot of students want to give their opinion as scientific facts, but it's not. And so this is a great way to get students to differentiate opinion from fact. And then some of them didn't even bother to tell me whether or not this was good science or not, but that changed over time. Now let's allow for the data to speak. Here are the average Criterion D scores for all of our students. And as you can see, the baseline is week 2. The reason why I did not use week 1 is because week 1, I made this a homework assignment. And I realized that when students were not going to do it for homework, I couldn't use the data. So it had to be done in class. Nevertheless, you see an increase in scores over time. Then there's this dip, and I'll explain why that dip is there. And then the scores go up and then back down a little bit. But for the most part, we can say that there was a significant improvement in the students' scores and their ability to express science literacy based on reading a science article. Average scores went from 2 to about 5. The statistics are based on one section of 31 10th grade students that were used for my personal rating, but the graphs actually include data from 60 total 10th grade students. If we break apart all of the scores for each criterion, here's what we get. Remember, D1 is science explanation, D2 is evaluation and discussion, D3 is scientific language, D4 is citing sources. So what happened during week 5? In week 5, I actually stopped assessing D1 and D2 at the same time because it was too overwhelming for the students to do in one class period, especially when it was their first time doing this. So I began to give prompts where students were only asked to complete D1, D3, and D4. And then the reason why there's a drop in scores in week 9 is because I switched them over to D2 and D1 was not assessed. Students had gotten comfortable with being able to explain scientific knowledge. And then once I switched over to having them to discuss and evaluate scientific knowledge, the scores dropped again. But by the end of the year, I began to assess both of those strands again. This also shows that students were also less likely to use vocabulary and cite sources when singling out the discussion and evaluation. So discussion and evaluation is a challenge to my students, as I had suspected. We're almost at the finish line. Here are some of the lessons learned. Equity. Science writing leveled the playing field so that all students had an equal opportunity to perform well in chemistry. The writing samples that I showed you earlier were actually from a student who would normally consider themselves not good at science or STEM at all, especially math, and chemistry has math in it. But by working with my students on science literacy, now a student who didn't stand a chance at passing a science class with a higher grade now was able to demonstrate scientific skills that normally would have gone unassessed in traditional circumstances. And of course, this annoys the mess out of students who are really good at math, but they don't like to write their ideas down. And it also humbles the student who has always been successful in science, but they've never been challenged in the communication of their ideas scientifically. And then the other great thing is that the use of rubrics clearly just shows me the student's strengths and weaknesses in regards to scientific literacy and argumentation. Now, here are the groans. 12 of these assignments meant I lost 12 days of instructional time because students needed a whole class period to read and write. They did. Because the writing across the curriculum challenge existed in all of their content areas, students began to detest this entire process because they spent a lot of time writing. So some of these scores might have been influenced by student morale. Even though most of the students showed some level of improvement, we still don't know how much student morale played a role in the student performance. So I would suggest that if you were to do something like this, don't do it every 2 weeks like we did. Do it every 3 weeks. Do it every 4 weeks. Here are some other interventions, accommodations, and modifications that I use throughout the process. I've given students opportunity to revise their writings over a period of time. So every quarter, I let them pick one of the 3 that they do, and they get to revise it. And I have a Google form for that. Testing or assessing strands D1 and D2 separately really helps students focus on a particular skill and develop that skill and improve it. Other accommodations included audio recorded read alouds, and Chromebooks actually have a built-in read aloud feature, which I discovered actually this year. If you have the money, use AI tools to actually have the transcripts read. I've even gone as far as giving students video recordings of a read along. And finally, I've used AI to give students shorter summaries of the article before they read the long version. However, that probably still needs a lot of testing because you can literally refresh your request every time and you might get a different summary of the article. Additionally, this writing across the curriculum challenge really exposed the fact that I needed to integrate more activities where students can practice using vocabulary. The data also showed me that teaching students how to cite sources and improve their ability to cite sources was easy. It was the easiest way to improve their grades. But unfortunately, their use of vocabulary receded when I changed up the prompt and they had to shift their focus to discussion and evaluation rather than writing a scientific explanation. So at this point, I want to thank you for joining me in this webinar. And you see below is my contact information, yo.phillips@gmail.com or ephillips@philasd.org. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Here are all the references that I've used to help me build this presentation and other iterations of this presentation, but it's all tied to science literacy, so you don't have to go and look for it. This concludes the webinar on how to measure science literacy. I hope this presentation was useful and all of the resources provided with this presentation are useful as well. Have a great day.